It all began on what I assumed would be just another evening. Dinner was over, and what started as our usual conversation about household responsibilities took on an unexpected edge. When I casually asked her about a bill that needed to be paid, I didn't expect it to spark anything more than a routine response. But the way she turned to me, eyes filled with frustration, told me this wasn't going to be just another mundane exchange. "I'm not your property," she snapped, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. The words settled between us, heavy and charged, like the first rumble of a distant storm. I froze, caught off guard. Was she making an accusation? Defying me? Declaring something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years? The way she said it, her tone, the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, made it clear that this wasn't just a passing comment. It was a line in the sand, a challenge to everything I thought we had built together. I didn't answer. What could I say? I only nodded, but inside, something shifted. Not anger, not immediately. What I felt was colder, more final. As I cleared the table in silence, her words kept playing over and over in my mind. Had I really treated her that way? Had I controlled her without realizing it? Or was this just her way of dodging the commitments we had both agreed to when we got married? I couldn't say for sure, but one thing became obvious. She didn't feel any obligation toward me, at least not the way I had always felt toward her. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a quiet realization took root inside me. Fine, I thought. If she didn't want to be my responsibility, I wouldn't make her one. If she wanted independence, I would give her exactly that. Not out of spite, not to hurt her, but because it was only fair. By morning, she acted as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The decision I made the night before had solidified into something absolute. I wouldn't announce it, wouldn't fight about it. I'd simply let it unfold. Later, when she asked if I'd handle the bill that week, I met her gaze and said, "You can take care of it." She hesitated, confusion flickering across her face. But she didn't argue. It was a small shift, barely noticeable. But for me, it meant everything. Throughout the day, I found more moments to let her stand on her own. When the kitchen faucet started dripping, I didn't reach for my tools. When her car needed gas, I didn't take it to the station. She noticed. I could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her brows knit together. But she didn't push back. Not yet. I wasn't doing this to punish her. This wasn't revenge. It was about balance. About making sure that if she truly wanted to be independent, she understood what that meant. That evening, the unspoken shift between us lingered like a ghost in the air. She could sense something was different, but she hadn't yet pieced it together. And I wasn't going to explain it to her. If she wanted freedom, she would have to own every part of it. Lying in bed that night, I felt something close to clarity. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of something new, something irreversible. And whatever came next, I was ready. Most mornings, I'd be the one getting up first, brewing the coffee while she got ready for the day. But today, I stayed in bed a little longer, letting her handle it. Let her take care of it, I told myself. When I finally got up and made my way to the kitchen, she was already there, standing by the coffee maker with a mug in hand. On the counter beside her, the car keys sat in plain view, a silent reminder of the oil change she'd been bringing up all week. I knew she was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to say something, but I didn't. Instead, I poured my own coffee, sat down, and casually scrolled through my phone like it was just another morning. A few minutes passed in silence before she finally spoke. "You're taking the car in today, right?" Without glancing up, I gave a simple answer. "No, you can handle that." Her hand stopped mid-lift, the mug hovering just below her lips. "What do you mean? You always take care of that." I shrugged, keeping my tone even. "Not this time. It's your car." For a second, I thought she might argue, but instead, she just narrowed her eyes. She didn't say another word, just grabbed her keys, turned on her heel, and left. The door didn't slam, not exactly, but there was a sharpness to the way she closed it, an edge I wasn't used to. That was the first real break in our routine, but it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the day, I carried on as usual, keeping my distance, watching as things unfolded. Around lunchtime, My phone rang, her name flashing on the screen. I already knew why she was calling. "Hey, don't forget the car insurance is due tomorrow," she said, her voice casual, like it was just another reminder. I didn't hesitate. "You can pay it. The account details are in the folder." Silence stretched between us, just long enough for me to imagine the confusion on her face. "Why are you acting like this?" she asked at last. "I'm not acting like anything," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm just letting you take care of things you're perfectly capable of handling." Another pause, followed by a short, disbelieving laugh. "Okay, fine, whatever." That night, when she came home, the tension was thick enough to cut. I had deliberately left a few things undone, the trash still sitting by the door, the usual chores untouched. She noticed. I saw the way her eyes flicked toward the overflowing bin, the tightness in her jaw. But she didn't say anything. Not yet. Dinner was a quiet, stilted affair. She was waiting for me to say something, to break the silence, to explain what was happening. But I didn't. I made my own meal, left the dishes in the sink, and went about my evening without offering to lift a finger for her. This wasn't about punishing her. It wasn't about getting even. It was about balance. About showing her, without words, what life looked like when I wasn't the one picking up the slack. Eventually, she snapped. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she demanded, her voice sharp with frustration. I leaned back in my chair, finally meeting her gaze. "You said you're not my property, right?" Her expression hardened. "Yeah, I said that." "Then you're not my responsibility either." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she just stood there, staring at me for a long moment before turning and walking away. A second later, I heard the bedroom door close, firm, controlled, but carrying a finality that wasn't there before. As I sat in the quiet that followed, I felt a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't easy. There was no satisfaction in watching her struggle with the shift in our dynamic. But it had to happen. She wanted independence. I was going to give it to her. And brick by brick, piece by piece, I was dismantling everything she had come to take for granted. The next few days unraveled like a slow, silent war. I stuck to my plan, kept my distance, and removed myself from every responsibility she had expected me to carry. Little by little, the cracks in our routine widened. One evening, she came home from work, and the house was darker than usual. The trash was still sitting by the door, untouched. Normally, I'd have taken it out by now, turned on the lights, started dinner. But tonight, I was in the living room, watching TV, completely unbothered. She stepped inside, took a quick glance around, and let out a long, frustrated sigh. "Are you seriously just sitting there?" she asked, her voice edged with irritation. Without looking away from the screen, I gave a simple response. "Yep. Long day." She dropped her bag onto the counter, harder than necessary. "You could at least take out the trash." I shrugged, barely glancing at her. "It's not that heavy. You can handle it." Her eyes widened slightly, like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. For a second, it seemed like she might push back, might challenge me, but she didn't. Instead, she grabbed the trash bag, yanked it off the floor, and stormed outside, the door slamming shut behind her. And just like that, another piece of the foundation cracked. Her eyes widened just a little, like she was struggling to process what she'd just heard. For a second, I thought she might argue, push back in some way, but instead, she grabbed the trash bag with a sharp yank and marched out the door, slamming it behind her. The next morning, I woke up to something I hadn't seen before, a sink full of unwashed dishes. She'd always made a point to clean up after herself, but now, this small rebellion sat there waiting for me, a clear message. She wasn't going to just accept this shift without a fight. But I wasn't here to fight. I wasn't trying to win. I was proving a point. As the days went on, the little disruptions started to pile up. The pantry shelves grew emptier because I hadn't bothered to restock the groceries. Her laundry stayed untouched in the hamper, exactly where she had left it. Every overlooked task, every minor inconvenience, was a reminder of just how much I had been handling all along. With each passing day, I could see the frustration tightening her shoulders, darkening her expression. By midweek, Everything boiled over. She walked in after work and immediately noticed something was off. The house was dimmer than usual, quieter. And then she tried to turn on a light. Nothing. "The power's out," she said, her voice sharp with accusation as she stormed into the living room. "Why didn't you pay the bill?" I met her gaze, calm and steady. "You knew it was due. The account details are in the folder." Her hands flew up in exasperation. "Are you serious? Why are you being like this? This is childish." I stood up slowly, letting the weight of her words settle in the air before I spoke. "Childish? You told me you're not my property, remember? I'm just respecting that. And if you're not mine to be responsible for, then I'm not your caretaker either." I tilted my head slightly. "You wanted independence? Well, real independence means handling things yourself." For just a second, her confidence wavered. I saw it in the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. But then she let out a short, bitter laugh and shook her head. "This isn't about independence," she said. "You're just being petty." I didn't argue. I let the words sit between us, unchallenged, and walked past her into the kitchen. I wasn't interested in making her see my side. I wanted her to feel it. That night, I listened as she spent nearly an hour on the phone with customer service, frustration rising in her voice as she tried to get the power turned back on. It was a task I would have taken care of without a second thought before. But that was the past. I wasn't stepping in anymore, no matter how difficult it made things for both of us. By the time the weekend rolled around, the house felt different. It wasn't just the mess, the dishes left in the sink, the trash that had finally been taken out, or the groceries that had been restocked, but not by me. It was the silence. The tension sat between us, heavy and unspoken, like a Cold War neither of us wanted to declare, but both refused to lose. The effortless rhythm we used to have was gone, replaced by a series of quiet missteps and hesitant pauses. And still, I held my ground. That Saturday morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, sipping coffee, when she walked in. Her hair was still tousled from sleep as she made a beeline for the fridge. The moment she swung the door open, she froze. The shelves were nearly bare. With a frustrated huff, she slammed the fridge shut. "This can't keep going," she muttered, her voice tight. I didn't even glance up. "What can't?" She turned on her heel to face me, her expression taut with irritation. "This, whatever this is. You, sitting around like you're just some bystander in this house. We're supposed to be a team." I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair. "Are we?" I asked, my voice level. "Because last I checked, you told me you're not my property. And teams work on shared responsibility. I don't think I'm part of yours anymore." Her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw tightening. "Don't twist my words. I never said I wanted you to just check out of our life completely." I exhaled, slow and deliberate. "That's the thing about words," I said, my voice steady. "Once you put them out there, they mean something. Once words are spoken, they carry weight. You made it clear you don't want to feel indebted to me in any way. That's fine. But that goes both ways." I watched as her frustration spilled over. "This isn't about owing anything," she shot back, her voice tight with anger. "It's about respect. About not feeling like my life is dictated by your choices." I pushed back my chair, the scrape of wood against tile sharp in the silence. "Respect." My voice rose for the first time. "You think respect is me handling every single problem, making sure every bill is paid, cleaning up after everything without so much as a thank you? And then you turn around and say that all of that effort, everything I've done, makes you feel like property? If that's your idea of respect, then you don't understand it at all." She flinched at my words, her arms falling to her sides. For a brief moment, I saw something in her shift, uncertainty, maybe even regret. But just as quickly, she pulled herself together. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again, but it carried the same determination. "I never asked you to do all of that." I took a step forward, closing the space between us. "No, you didn't," I admitted. "But you sure as hell expected it. Every time I stepped up to make things easier, you let me. Every time I carried the weight, you leaned on it. And when I finally tried to talk about how that felt, how exhausting it was, you brushed it off. Called it controlling." Her eyes turned glassy, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She exhaled, her voice breaking slightly. So what now? We just keep doing this. Keep tearing each other down. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned back toward the table, picking up my coffee, though I had no intention of drinking it. I stared into the dark liquid for a long moment before finally speaking. I don't know, I admitted. But I do know I'm done being the only one carrying this load. You wanted independence? You got it. But don't expect me to be here picking up the pieces when it all falls apart. She stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for me to soften my words, to take them back. But I didn't. And when she realized I wouldn't, she let out a shaky breath and left the room. This time, there was no slammed door, just a soft, deliberate click as it shut behind her. I sat at the table for a while after that, my coffee untouched, the house wrapped in a silence so deep it almost felt unnatural. It was the quiet that comes after a storm, the kind that makes you wonder if the damage is reparable or if there's even a reason to try. But nothing magically changed after that argument. If anything, the space between us only grew wider. Days passed, and we existed in this strange limbo, moving around each other like strangers in the same house. Every glance, every word felt calculated, measured. Neither of us seemed to know how to fix it, if we even wanted to. The first sign of the cracks reaching beyond our home came when her friend Emily called. Normally, she would have gone straight to my wife, but this time, she called me instead. Hey, she said cautiously. I've been trying to get a hold of her, but she's not answering. Is everything okay? I hesitated for half a second before replying. She's fine, just busy. Emily didn't sound convinced. Busy? She missed lunch with us on Saturday. That's not like her. I had nothing to offer her, no explanation I was willing to give. Maybe you should ask her about it, I deflected. That seemed to end the conversation, at least for the time being. But it wasn't over. A few days later, my mother called. The moment I heard her tone, I knew what was coming. It was the same stern voice she used when I was a teenager in trouble. What's going on between you two? She demanded. She told me you're refusing to help with anything. That doesn't sound like you. I sighed, pressing my fingers to the bridge of my nose. It's complicated. Then uncomplicated, she shot back. Marriage isn't about keeping score. It's about partnership. Her words hit a nerve, but I didn't argue. There was no point in trying to explain this to someone who wasn't living in the middle of it, who hadn't felt the slow accumulation of unspoken resentments over the years. But the fallout wasn't just confined to our personal lives. I could feel the strain creeping into other areas too. At work, I caught myself zoning out, my mind replaying old conversations, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things had started to crack. She was struggling too, though she wouldn't admit it. One night, I overheard her on a Zoom call with her boss, apologizing for missing a deadline. That wasn't like her. Not at all. She had always been the one who kept things together, the one who never let things slip. But lately, the cracks were starting to show. One evening, I walked in to find her on the couch, her laptop open, her face buried in her hands. At the sound of the door, she lifted her head, and I noticed the redness in her eyes, the exhaustion etched into her expression. The Wi-Fi's not working, she muttered, her tone flat. I called the provider. The account's overdue. I hesitated, standing there, torn between stepping in and letting her deal with it on her own. After a moment, I asked, You know how to pay it, right? She didn't answer. Instead, she shut the laptop with a quiet click and leaned back against the couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Her words caught me off guard. Do what? This, she said, gesturing vaguely at the room around us. Everything. I feel like I'm drowning, and you're just standing there watching. My first instinct was to remind her that this was what she had wanted. This independence, this division of responsibility. But looking at her then, I couldn't. She didn't look defiant, didn't look like someone fighting for control. She just looked drained. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just affecting her. It was affecting both of us. The house was a mess. The bills were stacking up. And we were both too damn stubborn to admit that whatever point we were trying to make, it wasn't worth what we were losing, each other. I sat down across from her, the silence between us stretching longer than it had in weeks. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a pause, a moment of realization. "I didn't want it to get to this," I said finally. She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Maybe regret, maybe sadness. Neither did I. And that was it. No dramatic apologies, no promises to change overnight. Just two people sitting together, trying to figure out where to go from here. We didn't fix things that night. There was no sudden breakthrough, no grand moment of reconciliation. But the next few days brought an unspoken truce. Not agreement, not resolution, just exhaustion. We had both hit our limit. The first change was small, almost hesitant. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of her, bills, statements, receipts. When I walked in, she looked up, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she gestured to the chair across from her. "Can we go through these together?" she asked quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't defiance either. I sat down, and we started sorting through the mess. She had questions about due dates, about account balances, and for the first time in a long time, I answered her without frustration or sarcasm. We weren't working against each other anymore. We were figuring it out, together. That moment set the tone for what followed. She took more initiative, calling utility companies, setting appointments, even making dinner without waiting for me to step in. And me? I started picking up responsibilities again, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. If she left dishes in the sink, I washed them. If the trash needed to go out, I took it without thinking twice. It wasn't about going back to the way things had been. It was about finding something better. And then, one evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, she muted the sound and turned to me. "Do you really think I don't appreciate you?" Her question caught me off guard. I took a moment before answering. "Sometimes, yeah." It felt like everything I did was just expected, like it didn't matter. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I never meant for it to feel that way. I guess I got so used to you handling things, I didn't stop to think about what that must have been like for you. And I didn't tell you when I needed help. I admit it. I just let it pile up until it turned into resentment." That moment changed something. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't perfect, but we started having real conversations, ones that didn't turn into fights, ones where we actually listened. The tension didn't vanish overnight, but for the first time, we were both making the effort. Slowly, things started to shift. The house got cleaner, the weight between us lighter. The scars of those weeks didn't disappear, but they served as a reminder of how close we came to losing everything and how hard we had to fight to rebuild. One night, as we sat at the dinner table, she reached across and placed her hand on mine. "I don't want things to go back to the way they were," she said. "But I don't want to lose this either." I squeezed her hand gently, nodding. "Me neither." And just like that, we found our way forward, not as obligations or burdens, but as partners, figuring out how to carry the weight together.